One of my goals while making a video is to try and fully represent what I'm talking about in a scope further than just my personal preferences, to go beyond how good or fun I think something like a game is. I see game design as an interesting way to represent things that go above just being good games, as its own unique way of expression, so whenever I want to talk about a game, its story and mechanics, my point always aims to try presenting a perspective on how these elements work and blend in, creating the finalized product that we all get to experience. It's nothing that other people haven't done, perhaps better than me, but I do have a standard of quality that I try to achieve. Originally, I wanted to make a video about a much broader topic, but that cemented what I thought about myself and the videos I make, as topics that cover multiple games require a deeper understanding of each of these games, at least if I want to make video that feels good enough for me to actually put here. So I gave up on that idea and went back to the drawing board, but it made me realize that I wanted to challenge myself in order to actually get closer to that ability to analyze games that I have played through. And perhaps the best way to do that was to talk about a game that, for the lack of a better way to put it, I have always found myself conflicted upon. Mega Man X is perhaps one of the most recognizable pieces of the Super Nintendo, the Mega Man series, and well, perhaps platformers as a whole. It's a game that is so many people's childhood and that they adore to just go back and remember how good this piece of their past is. I would now, as someone who technically falls into that category. Yet there is this strange space between how much I enjoy this game and how good it is as a full product. Not in a "I think this game is bad" kind of sense, but instead about the concessions that the game has to make in order to be the game that people want it to be. Today, I want to present you the perspective of someone who's conflicted on a game they like, to show the ways that this phenomenal game lands all the points it wants to present, but at the same time sacrifices other aspects of its own identity to become the game that many people love. Let's talk about Mega Man X and the parallel of progress. The context of when, how, and why Mega Man X were created are more or less fundamental to understand why the game became exactly as it is. The early 90s were a pretty major time for the evolution of video games as a form of media, as we witnessed one of the first major pushes in console gaming in the form of the Super Famicom, which was a direct continuation of the dominant Nintendo console they had released 7 years prior. With it came a much more powerful hardware capable of creating games that were way beyond what was usually seen at the time, outside of, say, the Mega Drive. The difference with the aforementioned, however, is that a lot of game companies had already found their footing with some game franchises back in the Famicom. Nintendo had Mario, Zelda, and many others. Konami had Contra and Castlevania, Squaresoft had Final Fantasy, and so on and so forth. This matters because a crucial aspect that defines a lot of the most popular games in this console is that they are continuations of an already established series, but utilizing all the new capabilities that the console provided to create a much bigger game, adding better visuals and design elements that just couldn't be done back in the Famicom. Super Mario World, Super Metroid, Final Fantasy IV, Contra 3, The Alien Wars, these games all shared that aspect of being big new pushes of the series that they were a part of. Something that left a major impression on the people who grew up with these games. It's a fundamental part of the impact that the console had at the time. It felt like a huge step forward. So with Mega Man being such a well-established series by this point, having 5 different games in the NES, it was only fitting that the franchise had to also do a jump into the 16-bit era, and that it had to be something big for the company. But the thing with Mega Man at that point in time was that, well, the franchise was kind of basically built on the exact opposite of what this big massive jump was. You see, the evolution of the classic Mega Man games from 1 through 6 is something that you can absolutely feel if you play through the games, but there's no denying that the franchise never really moved too far from what it originally was. A platformer with a focus on being able to pick and play the stages in any order you desire, and the ability to get new abilities as you beat bosses. There may have been some additions or elements removed from each game in this series, but when you compare something like Super Mario Bros. 3 to the original, and then look at Mega Man 1 and 3 together, you can definitely notice that 1 was pushing the bar a lot further in terms of creativity and uniqueness between entries. Instead, Mega Man games generally separated themselves in, well, becoming better structured games. If you play through the games in order, you can really tell that by the time you reach Mega Man 4, a lot of details such as the quality of the stages, the options you have access to, the boss design is generally a lot better in contrast to the older entries. Granted, Mega Man has always been a series where people will discuss until the eventual hit death of the universe about which game is the best, but I do believe that even people who prefer older entries can see that generally speaking, the newer games had a more focused design that was built with the experience that they had gathered. And here's why the Super Mega Man project, as it was known at the time, was kind of a pretty tough demand. Not only was this game supposed to be the new Mega Man game for the new console that was much more powerful and have more content, but it was also the game that was going to revolutionize the series that its whole deal up to that point was that it remained consistent until the developers could focus on creating a better game thanks to their former experience. Combine this with being around the point where fatigue of a series that had already 5 different games in the former console was starting, it meant that you couldn't really get by with just making another Mega Man game. And the way they went tackling this is one that left an effect that was going to be felt by the entire Mega Man IP forever. When you boot up Mega Man X, you're greeted with a surprisingly serious atmosphere, with no music present as they show you your new protagonist, with a design that seems much more serious than the Mega Man we knew at the time. We see many details of this character shown, before a warning with an alert starts blaring that reads about how this robot, X, was one with the ability to think and act the way a human would, an android. This gave him potential unlike any other robot created up to that point, but one that its creator didn't want to unleash to the world yet, in fear of them breaking the first rule of robotics and becoming an unstoppable force that could destroy the world. So he was sealed in a capsule that would test its internal systems until he was proven reliable, which will happen in a future where his creator would no longer be alive. X represents an insane risk for the world, but also an infinite potential of what could be born out of him. This is what Dr. Light saw in his creation. As we jump into the first stage of the game, the first noticeable thing we get to see is a few cars running away, as we soon realize the highway has been invaded by dangerous robots, some of these robots completely destroying said highway. We fight against this giant mechanical being that on being defeated, not only can you see its brakes, but that the impact it has is so strong that it completely destroys the section of the highway you were fighting in. You find some robots that chase you and laugh when they get to hit you. Robots in cars that if you manage to destroy, you get to ride on the car, but you can also destroy the car further and see the engine of it. And at the end, a giant ship starts dropping enemies onto you, eventually ending with a boss that you cannot defeat at all, only managing to survive the encounter thanks to someone coming to rescue you. Someone who looks much stronger than you, but that says that you have the potential to become just as strong as him. If you compare the first few minutes of Mega Man X with any of the games that came before, you quickly realize how the style of the game has changed, and how this new intro stage, besides being a phenomenal tutorial stage as many have shown before, also represents the fundamental aspect that defines the core design of what this game wants to do, to create an experience that will stay in your memory, to truly demonstrate the new capabilities of what Mega Man could be. The way I describe Central Highway detail individual pieces that stand out on the stage, but a lot of these things you can completely remove from this stage and not much is going to actually change in terms of level design. The enemies that break the floor are just too weak to realistically be able to break a big portion of the stage, and even if they do, every jump can still be done with just some wall climbing. The enemies that mock you, the cars having 3 different states of technically still existing despite 2 of them being completely superfluous, as you never really need to actually get into the car to progress, all of this is completely unnecessary. Yet isn't the ability to ride on the car one of the things that comes to many people's minds when you ask them about Central Highway? Mega Man X plays around what the series usually was at the time to not only experiment with a plethora of new mechanics, but also in the way that everything is constructed, all in the name of building set pieces that any player will recognize, and this is all presented to you in the first few minutes, yet this is only the start to everything they built upon. If I were to list every single tiny thing that this game has that feels completely out of left field compared to what we had at the time, I could be here for quite a while. Visual flair is everywhere, with a lot of moments packing a punch, trying to show the impact of your advancements through the stage. Destroying the airship from the intro stage in Storm Eagle's airport, how you can see broken robots from other stages be crushed and thrown to the flames in Flame Mammoth's factory, a place that has also these pillars that completely destroy the terrain above. Launch Octopus having 3 mini-bosses on its main path, and then if you take a huge ship, it crashes into the bottom of the map, revealing a new area with another iteration of the last mini-boss. The way some stages can interact with one another, such as defeating Storm Eagle causing the ship to crash in Spark Mandrel's power plant, leading to the lights being unstable and the mini-boss to become basically useless. The evolution of bosses compared to Classic is probably one of the biggest leaps we have had in this series even by now. Long gone are the more silly looking humanoid robots that felt close to what Mega Man was, and instead we have these anthropomorphic animal robots that help in creating a bigger separation in power and capabilities, alongside creating better, more in-theme attacks that fit that design, but that still enhance that fantasy of them being much more powerful than you are. The eagle pushes you away with its powerful wings and dives at you. The chameleon not only turns invisible, but invincible. And the armadillo flies around the stage, bouncing like crazy. There's this exaggeration to every move that makes it feel like it's going to pack a huge punch. And while these bosses are still generally fairly simple, I consider their set of options to generally be more solid than what we had before. Remember, this is the game that has solid wall jumping, and thus bosses actually need options for you to not be able to just stall them out, which most of them can do while just using the normal attacks. It's good. This enhancement in power is not only felt while being attacked, but also in how we can defeat the bosses. Some weaknesses don't just deal extra damage to the boss, instead they can cause a reaction that is on theme to the element of the weakness, such as Armored Armadillo losing his armor after the electric shock. Hell, sometimes it doesn't even need to be a weakness, such as the way you can cut off Flame Mammoth's trunk or Launch Octopus's tentacles. It's not as if many of these features or mechanics are particularly complex, or even needed in the slightest, but just the fact that they exist can make this game feel much grander than what we had before. All of this detail, all of these set pieces and moments are going to stay a lot more in the player's mind than if the stages were simpler but perhaps better designed, which is what generally the older games aim towards. It's easier for the average person to remember moments such as when they first got on a right armor and beat enemies up while taking no damage thanks to it, compared to trying to remember something from a classic stage. This kind of design for spectacle was just not something common in Mega Man at this point in time, and I think that's a big part of what makes this game feel so memorable for many people. Of course, it will be a disservice to mention all of this while ignoring the fact that not only is Mega Man X more memorable thanks to this design, but also in part due to some of the changes in the formula they presented. Mega Man games have always been built with this reverse difficulty scale for the first 8 bosses, where you can see your character get stronger and you get to take advantage of the weapons that you have acquired. The JRPG-inspired addition of collectible upgrades throughout the stage really does a number on enhancing that power fantasy that these games have. You get to see X transform from this clearly weak base form into a powerhouse that can destroy everything inside with ease, that cannot be taken down by normal enemies, that can utilize his weapons in ways that the original Mega Man could never imagine. X evolves both mechanically and visually, and for many it's one of the most satisfying parts of going through the game, and nothing really presents it as well as the feature upgrade people will talk about: dashing. Dashing is the biggest game changer in the game, to the point where a lot of people will suggest that you should always try and get it first. It increases the pace of the game to a degree that cannot be understated, as you can now handle everything in a way that is not just faster, but also more precise than 2x lack of momentum, giving you perfect control while dashing in the air. The mechanic is so game changing that... Now, I should finish this part first. The impactful style built to last in your mind that Mega Man X is built upon is even present in its music. Mega Man X soundtrack is one that a lot of people fondly remember, with stages that have music filled with energy. Long gone are the days of music trying to emulate rock the way old Mega Man did. Now we can have songs that are straight up rock. However, something that I have always felt about the stage music in this game is that outside of Chill Penguin, the songs don't really separate themselves in a way that defines each individual stage. A lot of classic Mega Man music was heavily focused on trying to present the vibe or style that the stage or boss represented. Fireman, Bubbleman, Sparkman, Farrellman, Starman, and many others have songs that I find to perfectly encapsulate what the boss and stage were supposed to be. But with the music in X, I can't help but feel like you can swap around some of the songs and it wouldn't really feel out of place. What I'm trying to present with an admittedly very minor nitpick is that the new way the game was seen and made changed in a way that kind of led to some of the advancements or fundamental aspects of design that the series had up to that point being left behind. And this led to some side effects that I do believe that hampered how good this game truly is. Well, in order to be able to talk about this, I have to actually go ahead and tell you about Mega Man X, not just as an enjoyable experience, but as a game that you go through. And this is the point where things start to get a little bit muddled for me. When you first play Mega Man X on your own, there is something that you're going to realize fairly quickly. Mega Man X is a hard game. A lot of enemies have a lot of HP. Some challenges can feel quite demanding, and your health pool is fairly small, so you can't really make many mistakes before being in danger, unless you want to constantly grind for health. Bosses have huge health bars in comparison to you, and some attacks are either super tough to avoid, or it feels like if you fail to position yourself, you just can't. This all culminates in a game that can feel very frustrating at times with what it asks you to do, and combined with how some areas feel like they have nothing going on, just being straight hallways with no enemies, you might end up dropping the game out of a combination of boredom and annoyance. However, this dynamic changes the moment you perform the quintessential Mega Man X decision, entering Kill Penguin stage and getting the dash. Dashing not only increases the speed at which you can traverse the stages, but it combined with your ability to wall jump and to keep momentum in the air after dashing, completely warps the way you approach everything. This change in how you can move around the stage and bosses warps the way you tackle these encounters. You are now a whole other character basically. Now the game starts to make sense. You can finally get some of these upgrades that you kept seeing but didn't know how to obtain. Bosses like Flame Mammoth to Stomp could sometimes get you become pushovers as most of their attacks become so easy to avoid, alongside his stage being frozen and granting you access to this health upgrade, which when combined with the armor upgrade makes Tin Chameleon's attacks go from pokes that will build up over time and become a threat to you, to basically non-issues as you can easily win the damage race against him. You now have weapons to experiment against bosses. You take advantage of the dash shot dealing 2 damage. Armored Armadillo gets destroyed by his weakness, and you slowly but surely become this one-man army capable of doing anything they want, and survive anything that is in a spike shape. Hell, by the end, if you have seen it on the internet or just stumbled through it, you can unlock the Street Fighter Hadouken to just one-hit KO almost any boss in the game. And as a note for the people who struggle with it, it's not that you're doing it wrong, it's more likely that you're doing it too fast. The game reads your inputs slowly, so separate the time between the actual quarter circle and the shoot button. And it is through this process of upgrading yourself that you realize something. Mega Man X is a pretty easy game once you understand it, except by the end when it gets a bit tougher at the final boss, but it makes sense, it is the final boss after all. You can still beat it with a couple of sub-tanks. So now that you know the truth about Mega Man X, you can play it correctly now. You start your playthrough in Chill Penguin and go from there, as dashing is crucial to the experience. You no longer think very much about the areas you can speed past through. You ignore a decent amount of level in some stages as you can just power through it. You have now entered the comfort zone of Mega Man X, the area where most people decide to stay, as the game is very fun that way. You might even focus now on something like optimizing your route for the minimum amount of revisits, or perhaps go for a low percent round, as that one still obtains the dash boots. It's all fun and enjoyable from this point on, as the game has proven to be just great despite the rough start. But there are a couple of things that you're ignoring, aren't you? The empty hallways are still there, being completely useless to the experience. Going for a dash early means that you never get to actually see the way Flame Mammoth stage is supposed to look. And speaking of Flame Mammoth, he becomes a complete pushover just like some other bosses, and in some cases like Launch Octopus or Storm Eagle, one or two of their attacks become completely worthless, as if some parts of the game weren't built with dashing in mind. The head upgrade fails to be anything of actual relevance, instead just being a log for the Buster upgrade, which is one you're going to get on the Sigma Fortress anyways. Most enemies are built with your starting health in mind, so it's not hard for you to eventually reach a point where you can just ignore everything and go. Your new level of charge and the way it's made to look all fancy and dramatic, even having a back hitbox, sometimes deals less damage than your normal charge shot. And the ability to fully charge weapons fails for almost all of them, as the time it takes to fully charge a weapon and the cost makes it almost worthless for most. Except for the one you could be using if you wanted to win, Chameleon Sting, the one that just turns you invincible. If you play your cards right, Chameleon Sting and the Buster upgrade can be obtained after 4 stages, meaning that the other half of the main stages and every Sigma stage can be played while almost completely ignoring the actual level or enemy design. And even if you don't go out of your way to unlock the charge shot, you still get it very early on Sigma Fortress 1, meaning that you can still just skip everything after that if you really wanted to. Mega Man X and the combination of some of the decisions in how the game was presented alongside this focus on impressions has some side effects that unfortunately damage the game experience, and I don't think this is something one should just ignore when talking about the game. A lot of these memorable set pieces, while cool, can sometimes fail to truly blend well with the strengths that the Mega Man franchise had. I focused on dashing so much because I truly believe that leaving it as its own upgrade was one of the biggest mistakes that this game could have made in the long run, as it is the thing that truly creates so many of the other holes this game has. It means that you always have a starting point in the series about tackling challenges in your own way. It means that the stages have to be designed with no dashing in mind, and thus they feel super basic when you can move past them so easily. It means that a feature of the game that so many people remember fondly kind of fails at its job, as the game cannot be designed to truly make it enhance your experience as much as it could. I think it's most noticeable that they didn't realize the potential of dashing in the stage where you unlock it. As something that always stood out to me is that right after you unlock dashing, something major happens. Nothing. The one stage they had where they could guarantee that the player will have the ability doesn't actually test your ability to use it, neither does the boss on that matter. In fact, you can actually beat the entire game without ever dashing. Not even the Sigma stages bother to actually challenge you to utilize it. It's so confusing to me, as it's a feature that feels so crucial to the game, yet at the same time the game is not built for it. There's a lot of things I could take from this game that perhaps some may see as nitpicks or complaints that won't happen if you know how to avoid it. But at the same time I have this constant dilemma where I know that, for example, because I really have to hammer in how much dashing warps this game, Mega Man X isn't built for you to just get the dash immediately. My main example of this being Storm Eagle, a boss that is almost completely useless when you fight him with the dash. 2 out of his 4 attacks do nothing to you, and the other 2 are a joke to avoid with it too. I know that bosses and difficulty are something that can be subjective, and that bosses becoming much easier with something like their weakness is common in Mega Man. But the way that it happens to this boss doesn't feel right, because the boss completely fails at being a challenge at that point. I have always thought about that perfect balance on when to get the dash to enjoy everything as much as possible. I can say that the game is better without dashing, as now these empty paths go back to just being wasted time, you lock yourself out of many upgrades, and some bosses such as Spark Mandrill become incredibly tough. There is no correct answer here, and that is something that I have always been conflicted about, as even if I find an intended way to play the game that finds the perfect sweet spot of when to get the upgrade in terms of game feel, it still fails at being the cool part of Mega Man that I like so much, just going to wherever I want to see a cool way to utilize my current weapons. The side progression being behind weapons makes perfect sense, but because there's not much fun in backtracking just to get a single upgrade, it means that now there's most likely a correct way to go through the game in order. Something that, besides Mega Man 2 and its dominating Metal Blade, the series had generally managed to avoid. The illusion of so many tricks that Mega Man X has can completely fall apart the moment you think about them for a second. Right armor sections that last for literal seconds and boil down to just dashing and matching attack with no real risks. A boss that is supposed to show how impactful weaknesses can be by being incredibly long and perhaps for some tedious to fight without it. And that's the luckier fate of a boss with a reaction, as at least he doesn't get locked down into an endless loop of death. The impact of the stage changes in Flame Mammoth and Sting Chameleon being the complete opposite. One being so relevant that people only remember it for the upgrade it lets you obtain, and the other one completely ruining the stage as you can now ignore like 75% of the layout by going down. I can really go on and on about this, but at this point I think I have made it clear why I'm so torn on what I think about this game. It's a game that truly feels like something special going through it, but that so many of the features that come of its goal to be memorable create a neutral, or worse, negative side that's still present in the back of my mind, no matter how big or small they truly are. And, well, the endgame doesn't help to truly create this impression of a majorly flawed game, if I'm being honest. Since this is going to be about the final area, I might as well do a quick mention about the story of Mega Man X. And the truth is, I can't really do that here. The layers of confusing lore, the remake of Maverick Hunter X trying to retcon the entire canon, the lore that is hidden beneath your manual, the symbolism behind X's nature, and my inner fascination with the character is all too much to actually present on a video about the video game Mega Man X. I can't really do an analysis on something that is so deeply intertwined with what the future made of the series. That being said, the one thing I can give Mega Man X on its own is that, as a self-contained, more serious narrative of the struggles of X as he becomes stronger, but still not strong enough to save his companion, and the first manifestation of his unwillingness to fight, but understanding that there is no other choice, I think the game's narrative works pretty decently. Without the manual you won't really have any of the context at all, but it works fine for the story of a platformer of the SNES, I believe. As we reach Sigma's Fortress, the song that plays is probably my second favorite in the game. While I may criticize the main stage songs for feeling very similar, I can't say the same for the Sigma Fortress stages, as I do believe each one represents a different side of how the fight is going. A more low-key song than the ones we've been used to up to this point fits perfectly with the tense situation of assaulting the fortress of the final boss. Outside of this particular section of Sigma Fortress 1, there's not much that stands out of the Sigma stages. There's the boss refights that truly show how some bosses are worthless while you can dash, but because even at this point the enemies thrown at you are still the same lineup that is clearly not made to handle a stronger X, you don't really have to worry if you have gathered a couple of upgrades. And if you don't, unless you're challenging yourself, you can just chameleon sting away. I can't really say much about the first 3 bosses either, besides them being the only thing that seems to deal damage that feels appropriate for the time you fight them. Spider Boss is probably my favorite one, as despite being mundanely straightforward, the way that the boss speed scales and having to quickly make a mental outline of where it could be can be fun, despite most likely being too long of a boss fight. Rank the Bangda is a very nothing challenge unless you make it harder for yourself by destroying the centerpiece first, and D-Rex is just a pretty annoying boss when it gets low health, as it sometimes feels like a complete crapshoot with the way that it decides to switch between its attacks. Combine this with surprisingly dull stages even when you don't skip right past them, especially Sigma Fortress 3 that can barely even be called a stage, and you have what can feel like a pretty underwhelming, perhaps even boring, final gauntlet of stages. But this isn't really why I don't enjoy the endgame. No, let's talk about the final encounter now. You start with this honestly phenomenal piece for the final area. It's not particularly crazy or a memorable song on its own, but I do believe that it truly encapsulates this idea of being in the climax of it all, of being just a few steps away from fighting against the main villain behind it all. It's tense and foreboding, and combined with the first phase, it can feel like we're going to have a very memorable experience here. Belgarder is honestly just great for a first phase. It's got a couple of attacks that help him cover different options you may use, but have very clear windows of opportunity for you to take advantage of. It doesn't have that much health, but even if it's weak, it can probably poke you with a few hits if you can't just land a Hadouken on it. There are layers to this boss and the way it behaves. It's not super complex, but it shouldn't be either. It's supposed to be just the first phase, the one you'll have to deal with the most often, so it's fair that it has some leeway so that you can master it and deal with the other two. Anything I'm going to say after this doesn't really take into account Belgarder, because if the rest of the boss fights was like it, then this entire section wouldn't exist. But unfortunately, the moment you defeat Belgarder, that's when things start to fall apart. The first impression of Sigma can feel imposing, as he looks to be a stronger version of you. He's got a saber, he can block all of your attacks, he can dash, he can wall jump, he can... Yeah, that's it. After the nuance fight was Belgarder, Sigma feels like the complete opposite, as a boss that in essence only has one way of attacking, and that's dealing big contact damage. His AI is so primitive that you can loop him without even trying, and the only challenge he offers is that he does a lot of damage. It feels like we went back years in terms of progress in boss design after a great first impression, and it's not helped by the fact that outside of the Hadouken, the minimum number of shots you need to actually kill him is 16, and without the weakness, 32! It's a boss that just goes on and on, feeling completely mundane because you saw him in the first action you did in the fight. It is so incredibly underwhelming, and what's worse is that in many ways he's a perfect representation of what his next phase is going to be too. Imposing at first, but just boring when you actually deconstruct it. Almost everyone I have seen play this game struggles against this boss, and I did so too for many years. It's a boss that can feel like a wall. It's huge, it only takes damage from its weakness or a fully charged shot. Its attacks deal massive damage and are capable of killing you at base in 2 hits, and the opportunities to hit him can feel quite rare. You have only fought against this boss using weaknesses and utilizing sub-tanks. You may think that he's one of the hardest bosses in the series, with how complex it can be to avoid everything. But the reality of the situation is very different, and if you want to be safe against this boss, you can do it, and he doesn't really have much he can do about it. There are only 2 positions that you really need to be at any point, the middle or the hands. With decent enough reaction time, both of his grounded attacks become very easy to avoid, and once you get on top of a hand, there is more than enough space to just stand there and shoot fully charged shots. The only real threat at that point is the other hand, and you can just drop back down and start the loop again. I'm not giving you this boss rundown to help you. I'm giving it you to show you how even what can be seen as the toughest boss in this game, behind the mantle is just a big blob of HP that takes forever to kill and is not that huge of a deal. This isn't about me being good at the game. I'm not performing anything you most likely can do right now if you tried. I just went ahead and broke the illusion that the game, and many people around me, have tried to tell me about this boss. It's not a challenge, it's a test of patience, one that truly fails to live up to the excitement that the game kept trying to present, one that fails to utilize the new mechanics of the series, one that fails. As the game ends and CX reminisce about the situation at hand, I just go back to exactly what I went through with this game. This game that I still adore, yet that clashes with so much of what I believe makes a good game. I failed to defend some of the things I like about this game, and that same way I failed to understand why some things ended up the way they are. There's this part of me that doesn't want to like this game, The things that the limitations it has don't make it as good as some of the older games in this series. That after the excitement of their first impression settles, the game becomes something that fails to be a proper Mega Man entry. Mega Man X doesn't feel like it truly realizes the potential it has, as it tries to instead be a middle ground that doesn't quite satisfy either side of me. It's not a game that I have been able to solve in how it wants to be played, in how I can make it the most fun to me. It feels like such a legendary game in terms of name and status, yet if someone asks me about whether I would suggest it to them, it can be somewhat tricky for me to say yes instead of suggesting to start with something else. I know I'm saying sacrilege to many people who hold this game dear to their heart, and it sucks even more because I am also one of those people. I don't want to say anything of what I'm writing here, but I also think that the truth is more important in these videos than what I feel. Mega Man X is a truly special game, but it's also one that I find to be deeply flawed in the way that it's made. It's a game that I appreciate, but I can't fully defend a game that fails in big aspects of game design like this. Game design. I wonder why it comes up so often. When I wanted to talk about this game originally, what I said before was more or less a conclusion I had reached, but I didn't feel happy about it. Not because it said that a game I like wasn't as good as I think it is, but instead because it didn't feel like it aligned with what me and many others see, and what I actually feel about the game. There's this contradiction between the information I'm giving you and what I feel about this game, isn't there? It's strange, really. While I point out all these flaws that this game shows me, none of them are really brought up very often by other people. Many just enjoy the game and play through it constantly. I mentioned that comfort zone that many people have with this game, and despite me calling it out, I also can't say that staying in that comfort zone is wrong if you're having fun, because at the end of the day, impressions, game design, everything is built for the goal of creating one thing in particular: enjoyment. Mega Man X is flawed. It fails to truly reach the heights it probably should. A lot of its concepts aren't used as well as they could. It isn't quite a fully realized Mega Man X game, but it's also not quite just classic Mega Man, putting it in this strange middle ground. But is any of that enough of a reason for me to truly call the game bad? Isn't the game fulfilling its ability to create one of the most fondly remembered games of the SNES proof that it did its job? And this isn't exclusively about the people who like this game. The influence this game has can be felt up to this day. The Mega Man series completely shifted here. The classic games turned more experimental too, with collectible items and more dramatic set pieces. New Mega Man X games were born, and then the Zero series, and then the CX series. And while each one has its own identity, the fundamental aspects that started here were developed on their own in each of these series. This is not to mention the plethora of games inspired by the formula that this game started. The game was a success commercially, critically, and to this day it's remembered not just one of the best SNES games, not just one of the best Mega Man games, but as a superb game as a whole. It did everything correctly, it seems. So, are my points invalid? Was this whole analysis just pointless? Of course not, there's always room for things to be better. But that doesn't mean that we can't appreciate what we already have, and what we like about it. I enjoy revisiting this game constantly because I know I enjoy my time with it. It's a fun, bite-sized experience. I can just play through it if I feel like every so often to either just go through the comfort zone experience, or to experiment and perhaps one day find the sweet spot of when to get the dash so I can enjoy the game even more. Criticism and game analysis are nuanced things that very often don't have straight out correct answers, and this is something that I really hope that more people understand. I love discussing about video games because I think they are such complex little things that can have so many layers within it, and everyone is going to see and value them differently. But we can still try to find a conclusion or consensus on what we see in them and what we love about them. Mega Man X is a phenomenal game that delivers the experience that it wants to present. It's memorable, easy to play, controls like a wonder, and it's really just fun to go through. Is it a perfect Mega Man game? Not really, not even close in fact. But that's kind of why it was Mega Man X. It was progress, but it progressed in a different path, one that separated itself from its classic counterpart, with strengths and weakness that it had to tackle. It's a new era, one that will impact the world in a different way. Love the games you love, learn about why you love them, and also why you don't, because the more you get to learn and understand, the more it shows how much the game truly means to you. And, you know, despite it all, I love Mega Man X. Thank you.